Hi, so this particular lecture is going to focus on Brecht, Bertolt Brecht, who was a playwright, director, activist. But before I launch into that, I want to just sort of discuss why Brecht is so important to looking at the play Ubu Ra, as well as looking at the play Ubu and the Truth Commission. So the PowerPoint on modernity and the conditions, modernism and the conditions of modernity and political theater highlights that modernism sort of is a catch-all for many of the different movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. And certainly Alfred Jarry, who wrote Ubu Ra, is considered a sort of precursor to both surrealism and Dadaism. And because of that, his work very much influenced a French theater artist named Antonin Artaud, A-R-T-A-U-D, Artaud, and his movement of theater called Theater of Cruelty. So Artaud was definitely considered a surrealist and rejected realism, rejected established theater conventions, rejected the sort of traditional relationship of the audience to the performers. And by extension, Brecht, who was basically born the year that Ubu Ra premiered, or 2 years after that it premiered in Paris, was influenced by Artaud's ideas of the theater. And I would have to say that as a director, Brecht is probably one of the most important directors of the 20th century, influencing artists globally, influencing the way theater is produced today. And so I'd like you to watch the film Theater of War, which really highlights and reveals who Brecht was, what some of his political ideologies were, and what he was trying to do with theater that's different than straightforward realism. So that's sort of leading me into talking about Brecht. So Brecht is considered the inventor of a style of theater called epic theater. And epic theater consists of different strategies. This is what Brecht basically innovated, created, and applied to performance as well as to his playwriting, to his directing. So the V or A effect, which is called the alienation effect, is both an effect that happens in the writing of the play, but also in the performance of the play and the construction of these different things together. And so Brecht created these different techniques that all fell under this alienation effect. Everything from using multimedia, so projecting the titles of the scenes, or having these sort of didactic explanations of location or year, time period, that kind of thing, to having the actors break out into a sort of song and dance, or doing a little shtick, to this idea of what's called the jest, which is a gestus or a gesture that encapsulates an emotional as well as psychological and internal reality of a character just in the one gesture. So these different elements were part of how Brecht created the alienation effect. And the idea behind the alienation effect was that Brecht wanted to not have the audience identify with the character in the sense that they would get caught up in the story, have an empathetic response, somehow, have sympathy for the character or the story that was happening, and then leave the theater and that would be it. That, okay, that was a great story, you had this cathartic experience as an audience member, and then you leave and the story ends there. Brecht wanted to challenge audiences to use their brains to think about what is happening and how this character is in this position. So, in other words, the example is Mother Courage, which you'll learn a little bit about in that film, Theater of War. But how did she end up being a sort of not just puppet of war, but making her living off of war? And what choices does she make? And if you were in that position, would you make the same choices? So really, Brecht was against the audience who would, quote, hang up their brains with their hats in the cloakroom, end quote. So this alienation effect is to make the spectator adopt this attitude of inquiry and criticism in their approach to this incident, this thing that they're watching on stage. So in other words, there was no attempt on stage to sort of put the audience in a trance, to let them lose themselves in this theatrical illusion. So some of the things that Brecht would do in his staging and in his writing is characters would speak in the third person, or he would move past and present sort of disjoint time, or actors would speak the stage directions out loud. And certainly the actors would address the audience both as the actor themselves, as the performer, but also as the character. So you're constantly being jolted out of the story because the sort of illusion of the story is constantly being broken. We call it breaking the fourth wall, or an aside in Shakespeare, but Brecht was using it as a way to sort of keep the audience from getting caught up in the story. And he wasn't interested in staging anything that would potentially look magical. So things looked disjointed, or he would use half curtains so you could see behind the curtains to the scenery and how it was put together, or lighting fixtures were exposed. So that's some of the elements of Brecht's staging. So this idea of fixing. So fixing was that the actor from the very first rehearsal would form an opinion of what was happening or the character that they were playing. And they would also try to understand for what social purpose that they were performing this particular historical event. So, sorry, that's my dog. So this acting style could be very fixed and set by the opinions of the actors. So the actors actually had input into their own style and commentary on the character. And that was because he was interested in this sort of larger social purpose of what characters were doing. And that influenced this sort of style. So then jest or gestus. So this is this sort of gesture with an attitude. And this was one gesture could convey this entire picture of a character or their dilemma or some sort of predicament. And one particular example would be, say, a just normal gesture would be, so if you had soldiers marching across the stage. So a jest would look at the soldiers marching over the stage, but as if they were stepping over wounded, dead across the stage. And so you would get this idea of what those characters were their social predicament in addition to the action. So that's sort of the justice. So then spaz, or spaz, in German it means fun, satire, grotesque stereotypes. It's certainly comic, and Brecht would interrupt story with these sort of comic moments of song and dance. And sometimes characters would be quite grotesque or stereotyped. They wouldn't necessarily be grounded in realism. And then multimedia, as I mentioned before, Brecht would use not just projection or text, signage, masks, song, music, all of these different things montage together, which is definitely very much a surrealist, Dadaist technique. So you could see how Brecht was influenced by the surrealists in this idea of montage. So this idea that Brecht created epic theater, what that means is that in epic theater, the audience must always remain critically aware. The message of the play must be clear. So some of the elements of epic playwright, is that they structure the play episodically. And I've talked a little bit about those two forms that we have, climactic structure and episodic. So here we have Brecht's work being structured episodic, and that we have an awareness of events in the past, that the audience gets told information through labels, through the use of cue cards, through that multimedia, and that this social or socialist message prevailed. And then many times Brecht would use a parable, so a lesson, right? That there's a lesson to be learned inside the play. And his work was definitely anti-illusive, meaning he wasn't interested in the stage illusions. So those are just some key ideas about Brecht's theater and techniques. And his work definitely has influenced Peter Brook, has influenced Robert Wilson. And the play that we look at, Ubu and the Truth Commission, which is based on the play Ubu Ra, is staged in a Brechtian way, using multimedia and some other devices. Now, Ubu Ra, which just means Turd King, is a surrealist play. It's considered really the first modernist play. And that play from 1896, it caused such an uproar. The play was vulgar, abstract, kind of crazy. It challenged the audience's ideas of what theater could be. Very much in the vein that many of these early modernist art movements challenged what art could be. So the surrealists challenging the sort of idea of realism, and even Dadaists, this idea that nonsense could have form and could have a political message. So Brecht was influenced by these early movements and influenced many theater artists today. And so Ubu and the Truth Commission is this interesting compilation of Brechtian technique with other elements, and I'll speak more about Ubu and the Truth Commission later this week. Great. Talk to you soon.